Okay, welcome everyone to Mountaineer Farm Talk. My name is JJ Barrett, Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources in Wood County. I want to welcome everyone, and I have one of my co-hosts with me, Josh Poplowski, down in Greenbrier County. How are you this morning, Josh?
Oh, doing pretty good.
Great.
Getting some precipitation finally on this dusty ground out here. So
Yeah, this spring kind of turned dry a little bit, but I'm sure we've got more rain coming. So the grass sure is greening up and growing out there for all of our livestock producers, and seeing a lot of people out getting fields ready, doing some field work. I'm sure that there's some areas where we were feeding hay and so forth. Those areas need reseeded. This last week was pretty productive. I want to welcome our special guest, Dr. Scott Bowdridge. He's up at the Davis College of Agriculture there at WVU in Morgantown. Scott, how are you doing this morning?
I'm well. How are you?
Oh, I'm hanging in there.
Good.
So we looking forward to having you on the program here. We were just talking before the program started about the goat test that is similar to like the young sire evaluation or bull test that we do through WVU, and we'll talk about that and a whole other host of things related to sheep and goat parasite control. Josh and I are also talking right before the program. Every week I do a little commodity minute at Mount Hope auction up in Ohio. The May 4th, 60 to 80 pound lambs were $3.60 to $4, and fat lambs 100 to 130 pounds were 267 to 345. So does that sound like pretty good prices, Scott?
Yeah, that's down from what it was a couple weeks ago. It was higher. So I think what we've heard from the USDA economists earlier in the year that lamb prices are going to stay pretty static and pretty high across the year. Part of it is because prices were so high last year, a lot of people sold cull ewes and culled a lot more ewes than they thought that maybe they should have. So I think that some economists are forecasting a lower lamb inventory and a lower ewe inventory, and thus a lower lamb availability across the country this year. So I think most people are forecasting prices stay pretty high.
Yeah, what am I wrong, or were those Easter week, those 60 to 80 pound lambs got close to $5?
Yeah, that's right.
So
well, they didn't really fall off after Easter. I mean, usually if you've got lambs to sell after Easter, you're a pumpkin and nobody wants them. But used to not be able to give away lambs the week after Easter, and the prices really didn't fall off as hard as they traditionally do. And that's been the case for the last couple of years anyway.
Yeah, that that lamb market, the thing is those lambs have to be born pretty early. We do have some producers that are moving more for a grass-based system. But yeah, traditionally that is the market, the Easter lamb market, to make some good money. Let's get right into what we're talking about, parasite control. Maybe first, Scott, tell us a little bit about the parasite lab, small ruminant parasite lab you have, and some of the research that you're doing up there in Morgantown.
Okay. So the thrust of my research is trying to understand the immune response in sheep to parasite, to grazing parasites. So we're thinking about worms that are affecting sheep. So we use a breed of sheep called St. Croix, and they are highly resistant to parasites. They will get a parasitic infection and clear it by themselves. They don't require drug treatment, and they get a little bit of popularity for that trait. Unfortunately, they don't have a large mature size. They don't have a tremendous amount of muscle. There's not a whole lot to them other than the ease of management of those ewes in a grazing system or a highly parasitized environment. So they've got some limitations to them. But they are a great scientific model to understand the basis of all that. So we use those sheep as a way to understand how it should work in a perfect condition and then start comparing it to other breeds. And we use the Suffolk as being our more parasite susceptible breed. So they get sick with parasites, they'll have more symptoms and they'll show more signs of parasitism. And then we can compare immune responses in those animals. So we do that. And we also do a lot of work with Katahdin sheep. So the Katahdin sheep are the most popular breed in the United States right now, based off of annual registrations. There's more sheep that are registered to be Katahdin than most of the other breeds. So that breed group's been very active in the National Sheep Improvement Program. So there's a lot of genetic data that's available with them. And they also have genomic estimated breeding values. So the accuracy of those data are a little bit better based off of their enhanced breeding values. So we've been doing work with them looking at what the impact of selection for fecal A count or for parasite resistance is on generalized immunity in those animals. So if you select for sheep that are more parasite resistant, are they more resistant to other diseases as well?
Do you do the fecal egg counts up there? Do you charge for that?
Yeah, we do. So the way we do this is that we don't. There's a consortium of small ruminant parasite researchers in the United States, and we all got together and decided that doing low cost fecal egg counts would be a benefit to producers across the country. So us, Virginia Tech, and LSU will all, and I think Texas A&M will open up a lab to do this, to do fecal egg counts for $5 a sample. And if you go to our website, that's called wormx.info, you can get all the information on where to send those samples, how to prepare them, and addresses and contact information that way. So we're not making a diagnosis of disease. We caveat this with that these are used for genetic evaluation in livestock.
Cool. Let's maybe start at the beginning. What has caused a lot of this parasite resistance that we have in sheep and goats?
So let's call it dewormer resistance to start with, right? And what's caused all of this? So this goes back to the early, well, and goes back even further. As soon as there was an advent of, or the invention of dewormers, you had worms developing resistance to dewormers. So anytime that you deworm your animals, you're shifting the worm population. So none of the dewormers were ever 100% effective. They're not going to kill every worm that's there. So the ones that survive are the ones that are going to contribute to the next generation. So anytime that you deworm, you're culling worms that are susceptible to dewormers. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
what happens then is that we had very effective dewormers that could be used on animals at multiple stages. And you want to think about the appearance of ivermectin on the market in the early 80s. So when ivermectin came out, you could give it to pregnant ewes. It was fairly safe. It was an easy drug to administer. So we've got an overuse of that drug. And what happens if you overuse it, you're continuously culling worms that are susceptible to the dewormer. Then you've got the only worms that are generating progeny in the next generation are the ones that were resistant to the drug. So we do that over and over for years and years, and then all of a sudden Ivermectin stops working. And
Yeah, was that one of the first poron on the market?
well, we don't use porons on sheep. So this would have been an injectable to start with in the 80s,
Okay.
and then it got shifted to a drench. In cattle, ivermectin and Dectomax and Prenamectin or Eprinex, Sidectin, those are all formulated as porons, and they're all in the same general drug class. So they kill worms in the same fashion. So we see this in cattle too. It's not just limited to sheep or goats. You'll see it in cattle. You'll see it in horses. There's a lot of worm resistance or anthelmintic resistance developing in worms just from treatment. So one of the studies that we did a couple of years ago with the calf pool is just looking at calves that were down in Lewis County and in Braxton County, and those calves that were getting Safeguard as opposed to using Prenamectin or Eprinex, they had greater fecal egg count reductions as as a result. So, and we've seen this with the bull test at Wardensville, ones at Culpeper, Virginia, and down in Withville, Virginia. The bulls that are coming in that are getting porons, the fecal egg count reduction is not as great as when we use fenbendazoles or any of the white dewormers like they use at the Wardensville bull test.
Yeah, and and maybe talk about give our audience a little bit of background on the barber pole worm and why what kind of devastation that it causes to our sheep and goat producers, animals throughout the United States.
So the barber pole worm, or what we call it at the university, is just Homunculus contortus. It is a blood-feeding parasite that lives in the fourth compartment of the ruminant stomach. So this parasite is ingested when animals are grazing pastures. They pick up the L3 or the larval stage 3 form of the worm, and they pick up that larvae, and that larvae travels with whatever the animal's eaten that it was on, and it goes into their rumen and will develop and go into their abomasum. It doesn't go through any tissue or anything like that. It just follows the feed. And then when it gets to the abomasum, it stops. It will develop, and it'll take about 7 to 14 days to develop into an adult stage. And at the adult stage, it starts voraciously feeding on blood. So those worms will move around to different sites in the abomasum and feed on blood. One worm can take about 50 microliters of blood a day. And that 50 microliters doesn't really mean a lot to a lot of folks, but if you got 1,000 worms in there, that's 50 milliliters. So about almost 2 ounces of blood on a daily basis off 1,000 worms. So that could be a lot of blood, depending on the size of the animal. If it's a small animal, that could be devastating. If it's a larger animal, sometimes they can deal with it. Nutritional plane is going to affect all of that. So if you've got animals that are grazing marginal pastures that are heavily infested with Homunculus, then you're going to see a drastic difference in those animals' ability to maintain body condition. So this is really, we think about this as affecting lamb performance, and then basically maintenance of ewes and how well those ewes can utilize nutritional resources. So one of the things that we often talk about, and some of the research that we've done at the university looks at how we can nutritionally supplement animals while they're grazing, and including a little bit more protein and different sources of protein to improve performance in lambs that are going to be exposed to parasites.
Yeah, what are the common signs, physical signs for our producers out there, that difference between whether it's something else or it's
Sure.
the barber pole worm?
So the great thing about Homunculus is that it doesn't cause diarrhea. So that's one of the first things. Typically, you think about animals being wormy, they're going to have diarrhea. And that's not, Homunculus doesn't do that. If anything, you're going to see a little bit a darker color to their feces with some of the blood that's coming out of their digestive tract. Ill thrift, a poor wool coat. One of the big things that we look at, particularly with Homunculus, is looking at their level of anemia. And we can score that using the FOMACHA system. So the FOMACHA system is just a way of looking at as an on-farm test to evaluate anemia. So we can look at the lower eyelid of those animals and determine if they are anemic. And if they're anemic it doesn't tell you if they're anemic due to parasitism, it just tells you if they're anemic. And if they're out there grazing, they're exposed to worms, then there's a high possibility that's caused by Homunculus. So that's really the big physiological characteristic. The other thing that happens with these animals when they're heavily infested is that they'll develop something called bottle jaw. So it's just edema that occurs around their throat latch or right around underneath their jaw. That's because sheep are walking around with their head down on the ground most of the time, and that becomes the lowest point on that animal, or their center of gravity, or just the lowest point in them. So fluid will leak out of their veins and it'll leak out around their face. So you'll see lambs that have just like a puffy area underneath their jaw that's very pronounced and very fluid filled. So that'll give you another sign of severe edema or anemia that's in those lambs.
Yeah, and I guess when we're talking about what are there some other parasites that we need to worry about, or is pretty much the barber pole worm is what we need to focus on for parasites in sheep and goats?
The barber pole worm's the one that's going to hit you the hardest. I mean, that's the one that's the most pathogenic and is going to cause the most problems. That doesn't mean that's the only parasite that you're going to find. There's other ones. There's the brown stomach worm or Telar dorsagia that also resides in the abomasum. There's also a Trichostrongylus that lives in the small intestine, and they all will interrupt with animals' ability to be productive and functional in a grazing system. And we need to be mindful of those parasites. I just don't know if they're the ones that are going to cause the most damage. The other part about with parasites, usually we think about them as being worms, but coccidia is also a parasite. And coccidia can have as drastic an effect as homuncus can sometimes, depending on your particular production system. So anytime animals get stressed or change in feed, change in diet, or climate can also bring about a coccidia outbreak in those animals. And those lambs that get a heavy load of coccidia are really tough to recover. They just take a long time for repair to occur inside their small intestine so they can actually utilize nutritional resources.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times, Scott, that we have producers, they see diarrhea and they immediately think that it's a worm issue. And then here they have coccidiosis. Is that pretty common?
Yep. Yep. So I usually think about lambs that are grazing on grass. There's some things that are going to cause differences in passage rate. So the type of forages that are out there, how wet those forages are, those type of things are going to cause differences in fecal consistency. And we've got to be mindful of when you're evaluating feces, what's the rest of the group look like, right? So if you see one animal that is maybe they just ate a lot of wet grass that morning or that afternoon or whenever they were eating, you have to be thinking about those kind of things. If an animal's in confinement and you are regulating what's going into those animals and you see one that has a lot of diarrhea, worms aren't the first thing that I think of. It's typically coccidia. And most of the time that I see diarrhea, particularly in lambs, I'm thinking about either a intestinal bacterial infection or you've got some problem with coccidia. Lambs go through a lot of stress and they're very susceptible to stress, and coccidia, the way I think about it is that anytime you see a sheep, they have coccidia. There's no sheep that are sterile from coccidia. They're always there. They can live inside the animal in a dormant state, and they're activated, become more aggressive when the animals are stressed because immune surveillance is reduced. So you get this outbreak of coccidia. You think about travel or shipping or those type of things. Those can also induce, or climate change can induce a stress situation in the animals, and then you'll get a coccidia flare up that happens with those. So some things that you can do to prevent some of those things from happening, using Corid. If you've got, like when we bring in the goats for the test, we've got goats that are coming from Alabama, as far south as Florida, Alabama, all through the Gulf states, as far west as Oklahoma and Kansas. Those goats have gone through a lot of travel stress. When they get here, they get Corid for 5 days. So we know that that's coming. We know that those animals are going to be stressed. We know our environment has got some coccidiosis that are in the environment, and there's nothing we can do about it other than prevent the preventable. So we can take some steps to prevent a bad outbreak of coccidiosis from happening.
Yeah, Scott, you're just talking about lambs, and I know we'll get into the FAMACHA in just a minute, but as far as lambs, you're talking about stress. Should we worm our lambs more on a schedule, or perform a FAMACHA test on those since they're so susceptible?
So I think that deworming lambs on a schedule leads into this concept of developing more resistance. So if we can think of, if you've got December born lambs and you go out there in February and you say, well, I need to deworm animals. Probably not, right? They haven't been on grass. They haven't been exposed to anything. They're not eating off the ground. If you're lambing in March and you've got lambs that are out on grass in April and May, and you start seeing some ill thrift in lambs or lambs that are a little bit thin, I still would FOMACHA those lambs. The other thing that you have to start thinking about is how the ewes are contributing to the infection level in the lambs. And a lot of these parasites can actually overwinter in the ewes, and we call that hypobiosis. So the worms will kind of go into a dormant state in the wintertime, and then after the lambs are born in the spring, the worms wake up, for lack of a better term, and they start producing more eggs. So when you send ewes and lambs out on pasture together, the ewes start dumping eggs out on the pasture, and about 30 days later, the lambs start nibbling on stuff, and then that's when those larvae are out, and then you'll get some infection in the lambs. It's a common occurrence in this part of the country, in the Mid-Atlantic region. We see this. It's a very well documented phenomenon that those March-born lambs, April and May, June, will get an increase in the amount of fecal egg counts that they have. And that's typically due to what mom's putting out there on pasture. So deworming those ewes or doing some sort of ewe treatment to help with periparturient rise can help reduce the load that the lambs have access to.
Yeah, and let's go ahead and jump right into FOMACHA.
Sure.
Scott, maybe tell us. I know that it's been around for a while. How FOMACHA came about, how people can get trained, and then how they can use this management strategy to increase the performance of their animals on the farm.
Right. So FOMACHA was started by we've always known that hemoncosis or Haemoncus infections cause anemia. And there are some researchers in South Africa that were trying to get an on-farm way of determining who to deworm and who to not deworm. And the researcher's name is Fafa Mullen. So Fafa Mullen's chart, or FOMACHA, is how this all started. So they were able to score the color of the lower ocular membrane, or just this lower eyelid, and score that color and link it to the packed cell volume, or the amount of percent of red blood cells in total blood volume. So by doing that, they gave producers a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being very red, 5 being just pale, almost as white as the wall behind me. So that gives you a scoring system, and it also gives you a recommendation of when to treat animals and when not to treat them. So our typical approach to this, and depending on how frequently you're FOMACHA scoring your sheep or goats, is that 1s and 2s do not get treated. 3s are that borderline of when you have to determine whether or not to dose. So the way I work this, and the way we do this from a research perspective, I don't know, we'll be out there maybe once a month doing this stuff. If I see a sheep with a 3, they're getting a dewormer, because I don't know if I'm going to be out there again, and I don't want them getting worse in the meantime. So our approach is always to deworm 3s, and then 4s and 5s. I haven't been very successful in getting 5s to stay alive very long. So even with any treatment or with any supportive care, it's very difficult for 5s. I've had 4s recover pretty quickly. It just depends on the dewormer efficacy. FOMACHA trainings are held throughout the state. So we've done, I think Brad's done one this year. I've done 2 FOMACHA trainings, and I've got 2 more coming up. I think there's one on May 10th. Hold on, I got the sheet around here somewhere. There it is. We got one on May 10th in Duck, West Virginia. That'll be at 3 p.m. And then there's another one in July in Ohio County. So you can come out to these FOMACHA trainings that are put on. You'll get a FOMACHA card. We'll show you how to do all of this stuff, and you'll be fully trained. I think Brad and I are the only approved trainers in West Virginia, and it doesn't take much to, you just have to take an exam, and I helped write the exam, so I don't know if that's fair, but it is what it is. So it's still that same consortium of small ruminant parasitologists that build that. So we all got together and we wrote this. There's Susan Shanian in Maryland wrote this exam and then sent it out to everybody and asked us if it was reasonable. And we said, yeah, that sounds fine. And you take an exam and then you're approved to train people. But Right now, I think Brad and I are the only ones that are available. There's also ones in Pennsylvania, Virginia, whatever's close to you across the border. You've got options if you live in some of those bordering counties.
Yeah. So basically, we're implementing selective deworming, or
Correct.
part of integrated pest management on the farm. Does that
That's
sound
right.
right? Um, how often should, and we get a lot of questions, how often should producers um, check, do a FOMACHA check on their flock or on their herd, and do they need to do it in the wintertime?
So during the grazing season is when I would be doing FOMACHA maybe monthly, and you're pulling the animals in just to make sure who needs to be dewormed and who doesn't, right? So you can the old way of doing this, we deworm everybody, send them out on pasture, bring them back midsummer, deworm everybody again, getting them ready for breeding. All we're asking you to do now is to think about, do you need to deworm everybody, or should you just deworm a smaller percentage of the flock? And this way, by bringing them in monthly, you can see those animals quicker. You've got a little bit more resolution to identify some of those ewes, and you may find out by doing this that there are ewes that are constantly in need of deworming, and they might cull themselves based off of those data. So that might be a good way of identifying some of the problem animals that you have in your flock. So about once a month is what we're recommending, is in terms of that during the grazing season. Now, during the winter time, if they're not out on pasture and they're not really consuming any larvae, there really isn't a whole lot of sense to do much FOMACHA scoring, particularly if you've got them up in a building or in a dry lot. They're not going to have exposure to parasites. So your frequency of doing FOMACHA and the efficacy of doing FOMACHA in the wintertime is not needed, the way I
Yeah,
look at it.
so you're maybe hit a little bit talking with some producers that have been doing FOMACHA for a while. They have been culling animals, ones that were consistently
Mhm.
needed deworming. Is that trait, those ewes or those um, does that are consistently resistant? Is that trait heritable or highly heritable, or what's the research show on that?
So there's a genetic component to parasite resistance. And when we look at this from the basis of selection on fecal A counts, it's a moderately heritable trait, and it's probably higher than what we think it is. But because environment affects fecal A count so much, so if you think about what the fecal A count is on a lamb in West Virginia in March versus a lamb in South Dakota in March, our lambs are going to have maybe a little bit more exposure. Now let's throw in lambs that are in Georgia or Florida in March. It's going to be different. So environment is going to play a large role on that. So that's going to affect the estimates of heritability for this trait. So most of the research that's done on this estimates heritability at about 25 to 30% heritable. So that means that of the variation that we see in fecal A counts, about 30% of the variation is due to genetics, which isn't terrible. I mean, it's about the same as growth, if you want to think about it that way. It's not as high as muscling, but we know that if you select for it, you can make improvements. So you look at the Katahdin breed as an example for this. They've gone from being, I think their average fecal A count breeding value was about 0 when they started this. Now the flock average across the United States is -50. So there's some, so that's percent reduction. So it's not the actual fecal A count, but it's the percent reduction within the flock. So you can get animals that are more parasite resistant by selecting for them. Is it gonna take some time to do that? Yeah, it is, right? So but the more emphasis that you place on it, the quicker the speed of improvement should occur. But you got to keep in mind everything else that matters: growth, all the other productive traits that you'd think about in terms of selection. You have to balance this with everything else.
Yeah, the tell the audience a little bit about the fecal egg count, uh, how you perform one of those, what you're looking for, and these
Okay.
manure samples. Or when should a producer take those into or send them in to get an egg count on those?
So we're going to couch this in two different ways. If we're submitting data for calculating estimated breeding values for the National Sheep Improvement Program, there's 2 times that we collect fecal samples on animals. One at weaning, so that's just a weaning fecal egg, or slightly after weaning, and then we do one at a post-weaning time. The post-weaning could be any time up to 1 year of age, and it doesn't matter. It's not linked with any other trait. So if you consider that or compare this to doing a ribeye area scan or trying to look at eye muscle depth in sheep, we usually have to have a live weight to go with that. With fecal egg count, you're just submitting fecal egg counts. The only caveat is that the flock average has to be above 500. So you need the animals to become infected to actually select animals that are more resistant than others, right? So that makes sense. So we need to have a baseline of infection of 500. So if you're lambing in December and you send me a fecal sample in February when you weaned your lambs, there's not going to be much there, right? They haven't been out on grass, they haven't been eating a lot. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to send in fecal samples to evaluate lambs at that point. The nice thing about the fecal egg breeding values that we have through NSIP is that we have both a weaning and a post-weaning one, and there's a large genetic correlation between those 2 traits. So if I get only post-weaning fecal egg counts, I will automatically get EBVs for the weaning fecal egg counts. So there's some advantage to that. If you're not participating in NSIP and you want to evaluate this in your lambs, one of the best ways to do this is just go about 3 or 4 weeks after weaning and send me a fecal egg sample then, right? And then do one maybe a little bit later as those lambs approach their market endpoint. And that would be towards the end of summer. But you want to make sure that the animals are infected. That's one of the big things that comes out with all of this stuff. So you can get an idea of which animals to keep or cull based on that. But I think the NSIP values are extraordinarily powerful in terms of identifying animals that have this trait. Now, there are only a few breeds in the U.S. that are calculating this trait. The Katahdin is a breed leader in the U.S. for this. Polypay, they have them on Suffolk sheep, on Dorsets, Texels. We just got that one started here a couple years ago, and they've got them on a few other breeds. But those doing fecal egg counts can help you kind of get an idea of where you're at with your flock, right? So the way that works, we need at least a 2-gram sample. And I would love to tell you exactly how much 2 grams looks like, but it depends on the consistency of the fecal material. If it's really wet, half of a golf ball is plenty. If it's really dry, I need 10 to 15 pellets. Don't pick them up off the ground. I don't know what animals did that. And there is also free living nematodes in the ground that can affect some of this stuff. So we usually like direct sampling from the animals. So there's a couple ways to do this. You can everybody's got gloves now. I mean, geez, you walk around, everybody's got latex gloves somewhere, nitrile gloves somewhere in your shop. Put one of those on, stick your finger in the rectum of the animal, grab a sample, put it inside the glove, take it on inside out, and then your sample's inside the glove. Tie it in a knot at the end. I just take a mailing label and wrap around the end of that glove and write the animal's ear tag number on it, so we know who it came from, and send it in to us. Keep it cold. Don't freeze it, but just keep it chilled. And send that to us overnight, and we'll get data back to you within about 7 days. So what we do when those samples come in, we usually get those processed within about 2 to 3 days of their arrival. We take 2 grams of sample, we mix it with 28 milliliters of a saturated salt solution so the eggs float. And then we look for eggs of a certain type. So we're just looking at strongyle type eggs, and those would be Haemonchus, Telar dorsagia, Trichostrongylus, Cupuria. They all have the same egg shape. So there's really no way to differentiate the specific parasite species that you have. All I can say is that they're trichostrongylid type eggs. And then we'll note if animals have tapeworms or if they've got coccidia. If there's high levels of coccidia in a particular individual, we'll send a note on that. But we don't make any diagnosis. This is not a clinical diagnosis of any disease. We're not recommending any treatment. I'm not a veterinarian. I can't make those recommendations. So all I can do is say, this is what's in your fecal sample.
And is there any cost to that?
It's $5 per sample.
Okay. Some management strategies. What for our producers out there, the classes of dewormers that we have, what do you recommend as far as switching products or just in general, maybe some recommendations for if we do start using Famacha, they need dewormed, what products do you recommend?
Okay, so we've got 3 drug classes in the US that are available to producers. The macrolytic lactones, so that would be Sidectin, Prenamectin, Doramectin, Dectomax, and Ivermectin. So those are all going to kill parasites in the same fashion. Now there's some different subgroups with this. So Sidectin and Dectomax tend to be a little bit more potent than Prenamectin and Ivermectin. But it doesn't. So the other argument is that Sidectin is a little safer on dung beetle populations. So of the macrolytic lactones, I tend to navigate or just to trend more towards Sidectin and Ivermectin just because they're formulated for drench. I don't like using porons as a drench. I think that we had to do that at a particular time when Ivermectin wasn't very effective. But now that Sidectin is formulated in a drench for sheep, I think that's perfectly acceptable. There's also injectable formulations of these, and those can be utilized in sheep. Make sure that you're doing that with your VCPR. So some of those are not approved for use in sheep. So if you use those outside of a VCPR and you don't have a veterinarian that is working with you on that, that can be a little problematic. So we just want to watch withdrawal dates on some of that stuff. Now, the other 2 drug classes, we've got benzimidazoles, and those are the white dewormers. So your Panacur, Safeguard, Valbazin, those are all fine dewormers to use. I don't particularly like any of those as the only drug class to use. There's a high level of resistance to those dewormers across the country. I deal with, there's a gal out in South Dakota lost 200 lambs in 1 month and just had dewormed them all with Valbazin. And this is a 5th generation sheep producer out of South Dakota. So it's not somebody who's not their first time. So Valbazin resistance is out there, and benzimidazole resistance is out there. And I think it can be a tool that you use with all of this, but it wouldn't be the main drug class that I'd be working with. The other problem with any of the white dewormers is you start running into some toxicity issues around pregnancy. And they usually say not to use it during the first 30 days of pregnancy. I have a hard time understanding when that could be when we put in rams, and it can be difficult to understand when the first 30 days of pregnancy are if a ew's been with a ram for 45 days. You don't know when that first 30 days are. So I think we need to be a little careful with some of the white dewormers around pregnancy or pregnant ewes. And then finally, we've got the neonicotinoids, and that really just kind of rolls down into one drug that's available for most producers, and that's Prohibit. And Prohibit is a good drug. It's short-lived. It's not in the animal system very long. It doesn't have persistent effect. It's cleared out of their system in about 72 hours. So it's a really easy drug to use. It can be toxic to animals if you overuse it. There's a producer in Virginia that called me that he's from West Virginia, he just moved to Virginia, and and had a bunch of lambs die from prohibit. So you can kill animals with prohibit. So you need to be real careful with your dosage and your weights on your animals and determining your dose going to the animal. So the safety margin's a little narrower on prohibit. So what we're recommending is certainly not to rotate dewormers, but I think the common recommendation now is to think about combinations. There will be no combination drugs sold in the US, not for at least another 10 years. But you can do this yourself. And that I'm make it real clear, I'm not saying to mix dewormers. I'm saying to use 2 or 3 dewormers simultaneously. And what happens with that is when you start doing that, you get a better kill on the parasites. So when the animals come in, if this is particularly important if you're bringing animals in. So let's say that you all of a sudden you decided to buy a potload of polypaid lambs out of South Dakota. I would give them a triple cocktail of dewormers. I wouldn't put it all in the same tube. I would give them 3 different drenches. I'd give them Sidectin, I'd give them Valvazin, and I'd give them Prohibit all at the same time. What happens is that if one of those drugs is only 50% effective and another one is 70% effective and another one is 60% effective, let's say the first drug killed 50% of the worms. Well, the other 50% remaining may be susceptible to some of those other drugs. And you get this kind of synergistic effect of those drugs to where one of them by themselves may not have high efficacy, but when they're all put together in combination, you can increase your efficacy up to around 99%. So that's what I really like thinking about that, saving that for that particular treatment for incoming animals and animals that are going through a quarantine procedure or animals that you're buying in new. If you're getting a new ram from somewhere, I'd give them a triple cocktail of stuff just to clear them out so you're not buying in any drug resistant parasites and they're dropping them all over your field.
Yeah, Scott, maybe emphasize as well, you were talking about dosage, the importance of making sure we don't underdose, like some of those white dewormers and the ivermectins.
Well, overdosing and underdosing, all of this is based on weight. And if you're not weighing the animals when you're doing this stuff, you're going to have a tendency to either be over or under. And I would estimate that most producers are going to err on the side of overdosing. So they're going to say, "Oh, that's a 200-pound ram. I'm going to give him a dose for 250 pounds just to make sure that I'm covered," right? Or this group of ewes looks like they weigh 125 pounds. Okay, so everybody's going to get a 125-pound dose. Well, some of those ewes are going to weigh 90 pounds. Some of those ewes are going to weigh 160 pounds. So you're going to be underdosing and overdosing simultaneously. The more frequently we use scales as a part of this determination of dosing, the more accurate we can be in that endeavor. So there's a really simple spreadsheets that are on the wormx.info site that have weight and dosage rate of all of the drugs that are available there. So you can go to that website, print out that sheet, and you can put that right next to your scale, and you can know how much to dose the animals based off of their weight.
Scott, tell us your contact info up there for the Parasite Lab.
For the Parasite Lab, it's all through the wormx.info site, so you can go there. My email address is my name, scott.bowdridge@mail.wvu.edu. My office number is 304-293-2003.
Okay. Maybe a little bit about what are some suggestions for some of our producers for pasture management to not only affect on worm populations, but how to maybe lower those a little bit, or can you?
So this West Virginia is known for its pastures, right? And remember, I'm from California, and to get the kind of grass that you guys have to have, I've got to pump water out of the ground to do that. So usually when we have grass, my folks at home don't have any grass. So they would love to have the amount of grass that we have in the summer. Now, we all think that grass is high quality, and we tout our quality of our grasses. When we start going through there and our forage species that are out there, You can get a couple of tests that tell you that the field's pretty good, but that's just based on the sample that you took in. So doing some pasture samples to identify what your chemical compositions of the pastures are, how much protein, how much energy is out there, to kind of give you an idea as to whether or not you need to supplement. I think that supplementation could be done in a very cheap format. It doesn't even have to be a concentrate supplementation. You can supplement with extra hay if you got it. And I don't think that supplementation has to be a large volume. It can be a small percentage of their body weight. So we look at supplementing lambs at about 2 to 3% of body weight, but using a very high protein supplementation. So anything that would include, if you've got access to some corn and soybean meal, or even including alfalfa pellets, something else like that, that can offer an additional source of concentrated protein. So if you think about animals consuming 5 pounds of grass, how much of that 5 pounds is water? How much is it actually dry material and has nutritional weight to it of that 5 pounds? When I feed concentrate, I know how much those lambs are getting, and I can provide a source of nutrition for those lambs to manage them on pastures. So if I can maintain the level and the nutritional plane of the lambs while they're grazing, I can also impact their resistance to parasitism. If they're nutritionally fit and if they're at a higher nutritional plane, they're less susceptible to parasitism. Now, if I know that I'm going to be grazing lambs on a parasitized pasture, you also have to understand that you are increasing the nutritional demands on those animals, because the worms are pulling out blood, they're pulling out the animal's ability to digest nutrients. So if you're not giving them more than what they need for growth and for maintenance, then they're always going to be deficient on their nutritional plane. So understanding that and thinking about that as a way to manage animals while they're grazing is important. We can talk about rotational grazing. I think that there's a lot of value to that. But usually when people think about rotational grazing, they are just moving. It's a way to manage the pasture and less about managing the animals. So when you're grazing this stuff, we've done very small plots with short day grazing. So they're only going to be out there for 2 or 3 days. Not everybody. We got a lot of part-time farmers all across the country, and you just don't have the time and the resources and the amount of money in fencing that it takes to accommodate that. So larger strips, leaving the animals on there for 7 days and then rotating through and then mowing behind the animals is a really important way of doing this stuff. The other thing is thinking about when you're rotating, which animals are leading, which ones are following. So if you've got weaned lambs and ewes grazing the same area, I always want ewes following lambs. I typically don't want weaned ewes on the best quality pasture during the summer. I'm just trying to maintain body condition in those ewes and kind of get them through until breeding in the fall. So I want those lambs to have the most nutritious pasture possible. So I may be moving them through those pastures a little quicker than what I'm asking the ewes to do, is to clean up everything that the lambs left behind. So the lambs are also going to be exposed to fewer parasites doing that, so they're not following the ewes. And then you got to think about your rest intervals between grazing, and that's going to vary at different times of the year. So rest intervals at this time of the year are going to be a lot shorter than they're going to be in the summertime. So we get into that late July, August, where it gets real dry. We're going to have a longer rest period to make sure that there's enough regrowth to actually graze and you have enough dry matter on your pasture to provide any nutrition to the animals. So balancing all of those things simultaneously, I don't have a single recommendation of what works best. It's what's your area, what's your grass composition, what's the forage composition that's in your pastures, slope, all of those things will affect that. And the type of sheep that you have out there are also going to affect any of those recommendations that we would have. So I wish it was an easy answer. You do X, Y, and Z and you get this. It's not that way, especially not in West Virginia.
Yeah, and maybe a couple wrap-up questions. You talk to a lot of producers out there. What percentage of the producers do you think are using FAMACHA, and how do we get more people to implement this strategy?
I think that there's quite a few people that are either using it or want to use it or trying to use it. I think it can be an important tool that we use in managing the parasite problem within our flocks. I don't think it's the savior of any of this stuff. I think it's just another tool that we can use to determine whether or not we need to deworm. I want to compare this to cattle a little bit. And if you think about dewormer resistance in cattle or in worms that affect beef cattle, how do we know which cows to treat and which ones not to treat? We don't have a tool like that in beef cattle. Sheep, we do. So we're actually in a really good position to be able to maintain our dewormers for a longer period of time. And I want you to think about FOMACHA as a tool less to control parasitism, but more to maintain the efficacy of dewormers. There are no new dewormers coming out. Nobody cares about sheep in this country. We're not a high priority commodity product. Anything that's developed in another country is never going to come here. We just don't have enough of the drug companies that are going to make enough money off of new drugs sold here to go through the FDA process of approval. So even though there's 2 new drug classes that have been approved for use in Europe and Australia and South America, we're not going to be able to have access to those based on FDA regulation. So we have to maintain the drug efficacy of the drugs that we have. And FOMACHA is how we do that, right? So how do we get more people to do that? Having these training events are a good way to do this. I think that a lot of this stuff can be done on producer demonstration farms. I think it's nice to have faculty come out from the university. Sometimes we're a little intimidating. I think that doing a lot of these workshops with producers on their particular operations might be more beneficial to a lot of the newer or smaller producers, so they think it's something that's possible or doable within their flocks.
Yeah, and finally, maybe hit a few take-home messages for our listeners out there as far as what you would recommend as best management practices to help control internal parasites.
So my background's in genetics, and I'm always thinking about, breeding for the need of animals that you have. What is your product end goal? What do you want to produce? What are you trying to sell? And then work the management process around that. So if you're selling, weaned lambs at 60 pounds, and you're trying to capitalize on using some grass and doing that in the summertime, having a ewe flock that has a basis with some parasite resistance might be advantageous to you. So thinking about some breeds that are more parasite resistant, like the Katahdins or even St. Croix for that matter. And a terminal sire can be extraordinarily powerful in those type of situations. So using a Texel ram or even I hate calling Dorsets a terminal sire, but compared to a Katahdin, they might be a little bit more terminal in some of their makeup. Using some rams to generate all lambs that you're going to kill or all lambs that you're going to sell. So considering some of those things, watching your dewormer usage, kind of managing that effectively. I think this is kind of come into light a little bit more with the antimicrobial restrictions that are going to come out here by June of 2023. Working with your veterinarian, establishing a plan and how you're doing those things can all be valuable. Thinking about the nutritional management of your animals, both how they're grazing the pastures, what they're grazing on pastures, and whether or not you need to supplement them, and really thinking about your mineral level in the animals as well. Do they have access to high quality minerals? Those can all help with nutritional playing. So we have a research project going on now between us and Extension, looking at copper levels in different sheep farms across the state. So is copper, we've got a lot of copper deficiency in areas across the state. Do you have some copper deficiencies that can affect animals' performance in general? So thinking about nutritional supplementation is an important thing in managing this holistically. And then utilizing the tools that are out there. So FOMACHA is a great tool if you are inclined to enroll into NSIP and you're a purebred producer, or even just using rams that have come from NSIP flocks, or rams that have some data that come with them, it can be another powerful thing in terms of selecting sheep that are going to fit better on your farm and reduce the impact of parasitism.
Scott, we have a couple questions from the
Sure.
audience. First, the St. Croix, is that a good breed to do a lot of crossbreeding with to get some parasite resistance?
So depends. So if wool is a consideration for you, then you want to avoid them like the plague, right? They're hair sheep. They're going to put hair fibers in your fleeces. That's, if wool is something that you're interested in, then no. If you don't care about wool, you have to start thinking about how many generations of St. Croix breeding am I going to, how are you selecting the animals that have been crossbred through that? So you're going to take a big hit in growth. You're going to take a big hit in mature size and muscling, and those are all going to affect graded market prices. So when you start looking at taking those lambs to Mount Vernon or Mount Hope, those are graded auctions. So that price range is going to vary based on whoever's evaluating those lambs at the sale yards. Lambs that appear to be heavier muscled are going to grade higher than lambs that are lighter muscled. Lighter muscled lambs are going to go in a lower grade group, and they're going to start at a lower base price. So you have to think about that with using St. Croix sheep. Now, an easy way around this is to incorporate Katahdins. Katahdins came from St. Croix sheep. They've already been developed. You've got data that are there to do this. Now, getting into Katahdins right now is about the worst time in the world, because you got a ewe that has a heartbeat and 4 legs. She's $400. So can you do this incrementally? Can you shift over? Can you think about using some of those different sheep? And there are Suffolk sheep that are parasite resistant. They're out there. Look for some Suffolk sheep that have some British breeding. I know that Macaulay's, there's another guy up in Connecticut that's doing a lot of work with some grass-based Suffolk sheep. He works for extension at the University of Connecticut. There's folks out there that have data on there. Even at our colleagues down at Virginia Tech have some Suffolk sheep with fecal egg count EBVs. So you can find those animals with negative values, and they're all out there within the breeds. You just have to find them, right? So I would be a little hesitant to recommend that, hey, yeah, we all need to start breeding with St. Croix. I think there's too many negatives that come along with that breeding, unless you're really invested into developing a unique composite animal for your particular farm.
What about, do you work with any goat producers that are doing for hair or for fiber?
No, I don't. I mean, the only goat folks that I work with in this case are the Kiko producers across the U.S. So there's a lot of them out of Kentucky that are using savannas, that are using myotonic goats. There's a series of different crosses that you can use. The Kikos seem to be a little bit parasite resistant. I think goats in general are less parasite resistant than sheep are, just because of their grazing behavior. Goats are typically browsers. They're not grazers like sheep are, so they just innately aren't going to have as much parasite resistance. But of the goat breeds that I've looked at, Kiko seems to be doing pretty well. And at least in our test, we get a range of fecal egg counts in those goats. So we get some that never develop a fecal egg count based off of the infection that we give them. And when I mean some, there's quite a few goats that don't develop. There's also quite a few goats that will have a large fecal egg count. So it is selectable. You can identify those animals and select for them within those herds.
We're starting to run out of time here, Scott, but I always ask this question. My dad said there's 2 types of music, country and Western. So I need to know who your favorite country artist, or if you listen to country music, or maybe you're more of a classic rock guy.
Oh, that's George Strait. There's
Oh.
you don't even mess around with that. So next
Just
question.
George Strait.
Yeah.
He is the king.
Or Chris Ledoux. I mean, either one of those, I'd go with either of them. So
Okay. Josh, do we have any more questions from the audience?
Believe that was all of them.
Okay. All right. Well, we've had Dr. Scott Bowdridge as our special guest today talking about parasite control for sheep and goats, and we appreciate him coming on the program. A lot of good information to process for everyone out there, and hopefully we will see everyone next week. Just want to remind everyone that the programs and activities offered by West Virginia University Extension are available to all persons without regard to race, color, sex, disability, religion, age, veteran status, political belief, sexual orientation, national origin, and marital or family status. This is Mountaineer Farm Talk. We try to bring research-based information to all citizens in West Virginia every week. Thank you very much, Scott, and everyone have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.